He grabbed my shoulders and shoved me backward hard. My head hit the steel shelf with a crack. "Step inside," John said coldly. Before I could ask why, he flung the freezer door open and forced me in. The cold hit me like a punch to the chest. "John, please." Click. The lock snapped shut. Dark. Silent. I gasped. My fingers burned. I pounded on the metal wall. Was this real? Was my own son trying to kill me? And if so, how many hours did I have left? If you want to know what happens next, stay with me until the end of the video. And if you still believe deep in your heart that God is always watching over you, silently arranging everything, then right now, leave a comment saying AMEN below this video. Because who knows, at the very moment you write those words, a blessing may quietly enter your life. They say time has a way of revealing the truth. I used to believe that until I found myself locked inside a freezer, fighting to stay alive, not from fate or illness, but from the very boy I once held in my arms. My name is Margaret Dawson. Most people around Bloomington just call me Maggie. I've lived 74 winters in this town, and I've seen my fair share of heartbreak. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for the day my own son tried to freeze me to death. It was a Thursday, cold, sharp air, outside typical Indiana January, the kind that bites through your coat no matter how thick it is. I remember I'd just finished checking the books at Dawson's Market. I still like to do it myself, though the accountant said I didn't need to. Numbers, they've always spoken to me clearer than most people. I was in the back office when John walked in. My eldest, Jonathan Dawson. Folks always said he was sharp as a whip, destined to take the company even further. But behind that charming smile, there was something colder. I saw it even when he was young, a quiet hunger that scared me. He asked if I'd help him inspect one of the new freezer units installed in the expanded section of our warehouse. Said there was a faulty latch, and he didn't trust the maintenance crew. Funny, isn't it? All these years I taught him to be hands-on, and now he used that same lesson to bait me. I didn't suspect a thing. Linda Harris came along with us. She's been with me since we opened our second store. Faithful as the sunrise. The freezer was bigger than anything we'd used before. Commercial grade, meant for massive storage. As soon as the heavy door shut behind us, I felt this eerie silence, thicker than the frost lining the walls. John's footsteps didn't echo behind us. The latch clicked, then nothing. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe a jammed door, but Linda's face turned pale, and she ran to bang on the door. No response. Just the hum of the freezing air. It didn't take long for the cold to creep into our bones. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying not to panic. Linda was already crying, whispering prayers through clenched teeth. My breath turned to mist, curling like ghosts in front of me. I reached into my coat pocket, thank the Lord I had my phone, but the signal was gone. Thick steel walls do that. Then I remembered something from years ago. Morse code. Back in high school, I dated a boy who wanted to be in the Navy. He used to tap messages on my arm during math class. Silly memories, but it gave me an idea. I pulled off one of my rings, my wedding ring, and started tapping against the metal shelving. ... over and over. SOS. Hours passed. My fingers were numb, my lips cracked, but I kept tapping. Not just for help, but for hope. And then just when I thought my heart would slow too much to tap again, I heard it. A muffled voice. Hello? Rosa Martinez. She worked the late-night cleaning shift. A single mom from the South Side, quiet and kind. She heard my tapping. She saved our lives. The paramedics said we were minutes from hypothermia setting in for good. I nodded and thanked them, but inside something else froze over in me. It wasn't just the freezer, it was John, my boy. The same child I nursed through chickenpox, who used to cry when I'd leave for work, who made me macaroni cards on Mother's Day. He had locked me in there. He wanted me dead. And so, as I lay under warm blankets in that hospital bed, with machines humming and nurses bustling around me, I made a decision. I wasn't going to be a victim. I wasn't going to let the story end there. John thought he was clever, that his plan would erase me quietly, tie things up neatly. But what he didn't realize is Dawsons don't go down easy, especially not this Dawson. That day, something in me shifted. Maybe it was the cold that woke it up. Or maybe it had been there all along, waiting. Either way, I knew this wasn't over. The hardest part wasn't the cold. It wasn't even the betrayal. It was pretending I didn't know. After the incident in the freezer, the doctors said I should rest. Take it easy, maybe step back from the company. They looked at me like a fragile old lady who'd accidentally wandered into a meat locker. But I wasn't fragile. I was furious. John came to visit the next day. He brought roses, white ones, of all things. I couldn't decide if he was mocking me or just too arrogant to realize what that meant. White flowers, funerals. He put on a performance like I've never seen before, holding my hand, brushing a fake tear from his cheek. "Mom," he said, "I can't believe that happened. I've already launched an internal investigation. Heads will roll." I looked into his eyes, searching for a flicker of remorse, of doubt, of anything human. But all I saw was calculation, cold, measured, and precise. So I nodded, smiled weakly, played along. That's what he expected. After all, a confused old woman grateful to be alive, too shaken to think clearly. He didn't know I'd already begun the count. Every minute I spent alone, I rewound the events in my mind. Why had he insisted on showing me that freezer? Why was Linda, my most loyal employee, suddenly reassigned to warehouse duty that week? Why had John avoided looking me in the eye for months? Then I remembered something odd from last summer. Thomas had left behind a small safe in our old home office, one he never mentioned to anyone but me. After he passed, I'd gone through his things and found an envelope labeled contingency. Inside were copies of property deeds, partnership agreements, and a handwritten note. If you ever feel like something's wrong, follow the paper trail. It was classic Thomas. The man trusted people, but he trusted documentation more. So once I was discharged from the hospital, I didn't rest. I got to work. I called Linda under the pretense of checking on her recovery. She was rattled, still coughing from the cold, but her voice dropped when I asked whether she'd seen anyone near the freezer door. "Mrs. Dawson," she said carefully, "I don't want to say too much over the phone, but you're not crazy." It was all I needed to hear. I waited until John flew to Chicago for a conference and drove myself to the main office downtown. Everyone smiled and greeted me like I was a ghost. I played the part, shaky, slow, distracted, the perfect camouflage. I asked one of the newer assistants, a sweet young woman named Tanya, to print some old accounting files for my memoir project. She was eager to help. Within the hour, I had a stack of reports from the past 12 months, vendor invoices, expense ledgers, and internal memos. And that's when the numbers started to whisper. There were contracts with companies I didn't recognize, MR Investments, Cedar Ridge Logistics, Pathstone Solutions, large sums paid monthly, often just under the threshold that would trigger board review. The signatures were digital, but I knew John's initials anywhere. The kicker? Some of these payments went to P.O. boxes out of state. I called George Miller, Thomas's old friend and our longtime accountant, and asked if he'd meet me for coffee. George looked like Santa Claus in retirement, rosy cheeks, white beard, flannel shirts that smelled faintly of cigar smoke. But he was sharp as ever. After glancing through the files, his brow furrowed. "Maggie," he said, "these aren't just shell vendors. These are ghost companies. Someone's bleeding money out of Dawson's Market right under your nose." I felt the blood drain from my face. "It's John, isn't it?" George asked quietly. I nodded. Couldn't speak. The words felt too heavy. We spent the next week tracing the payments. George brought in a contact from his firm, a young cybersecurity analyst named Jamal, who dug deeper. What they found chilled me more than that freezer ever could. John had created an entire network of dummy corporations. He'd funneled over $2 million in the past 8 months alone. Some of the properties we thought were still under Dawson's Market ownership had been quietly transferred to MR Investments John's initials, plain as day. It wasn't just greed. It was a hostile takeover. I didn't know whether to scream or sob. I thought of Thomas, how proud he'd been watching John grow into a man of business, how he believed John would protect the legacy we'd built with blood and sweat and sacrifice. And now? My son was selling us off piece by piece. But what made it worse, what made my hands shake even now as I write this, was that he tried to kill me to finish the job. I sat alone in my kitchen that night, a mug of chamomile tea going cold beside me. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The clock ticked louder than usual. I looked at the family portrait on the mantel. John as a boy, standing proudly next to Thomas. Peter with a shy smile. Emily in her graduation gown. And me, in the middle, holding them all together. Or so I thought. John didn't see me as a mother anymore. I was an obstacle, a name on a deed, an old woman in the way. But here's the thing about old women we know how to endure. We've seen loss, betrayal, war, death. We've buried husbands, raised children, outlived friends. You don't survive 74 years without learning how to play the long game. And I was just getting started. Sometimes, the only way to catch a fox is to let him think he's outwitted you. That was the thought that settled in my bones as I sat across from the neurologist John had recommended. A young, too slick doctor with perfect hair and no patience. He spoke slowly, as if I were a child learning her letters again. "Mrs. Dawson," he said, flipping through his notes. "Your recent trauma, combined with your age, may suggest early cognitive decline, possibly the beginning of dementia." I smiled faintly, nodded, then asked him if he wanted tea or bourbon. That seemed to rattle him. He went on, describing symptoms I didn't have, suggesting I step away from company matters and offering to assist John in handling my affairs. He didn't know that I had recorded every word on the tiny device Alex had hidden inside my brooch. Alex. My sweet grandson. Emily's boy. He flew in from San Francisco the moment he heard about the freezer. Law school had made him sharper, but he still had that Dawson softness around the eyes. When I told him what John had done, he didn't speak for a full minute. Then, quietly, he asked, "What do we need to do?" So we started building the case. George handled the financials, tracing every dollar John moved. Linda went through the employee rosters, identifying who had been fired, promoted, or replaced since John took over day-to-day operations. Alex helped set up cloud backups, encrypted email trails, and audio recordings. And me? I played the fool. I let John believe I was slipping. I began forgetting names at board meetings, misplacing my keys, wandering into the wrong department. I stopped challenging his decisions, stopped asking questions. He bought it. Oh, did he buy it? He began talking more freely, making bolder moves. He didn't even notice when I signed a power of attorney document that Alex had doctored one that looked like a surrender of my rights, but was, in fact, a cleverly veiled trap. I watched him from behind the veil of senility, like a hawk through tall grass. He thought he was hunting me, but I had the advantage of age, of patience. He moved to consolidate. Shut down 2 stores he claimed were underperforming. Sold off a warehouse that had been in our family for 2 decades. The money vanished into MR investments. George tracked it all. Then came the insurance policy. It was Linda who found it. Buried deep in the HR files, a $5 million life insurance policy, with me as the insured and John as the sole beneficiary. Recently updated. No co-signers, no witnesses. Just John's digital signature. That's when it all clicked. He hadn't just tried to kill me. He'd planned it for months, maybe longer. The freezer, the staged confusion, the fake doctor, it was all part of a timeline he'd set in motion, assuming I'd be dead before anyone could stop him. But I was still breathing, still watching, still waiting. We compiled everything. George drew up the case files. Alex contacted a friend in the district attorney's office, a young woman named Simone who had once interned under his mother. She agreed to help, under one condition. We needed a smoking gun. Something irrefutable. Something that would make even the best defense lawyer choke. So, we baited the trap. It started with a phone call. I rang John from the house phone, my voice trembling. "John, I'm sorry, sweetheart. I've been so confused lately. I think you're right. I'm not well." He was quiet for a second, then soft, too soft. "It's okay, Mom. Don't worry about anything. I'll handle it." "I don't want to be a burden," I whispered. "Maybe I should. go away for a while. That's when he offered the cabin. It was an old property out in Monroe County. One Thomas and I used for hunting trips back when our knees still worked. Secluded. No cell reception. The perfect place for an accident. I agreed. He even offered to drive me. The night before the trip, I gathered everyone. George, Linda, Alex, Simone. We laid out the plan. Alex would track us using a GPS chip hidden in my coat lining. Simone had a SWAT contact ready to deploy if needed. George packed a second recording device inside my scarf battery life. 24 hours. I barely slept that night. Morning came cold and gray. John arrived with coffee and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You ready, Mom?" he asked. "As I'll ever be," I replied. We drove in silence for most of the hour. Trees passed like silent witnesses. I watched his hands on the steering wheel. Steady. Too steady. At the cabin, he lit a fire, poured wine, played music from his phone. It was almost peaceful if you ignored the glint of steel under his coat. Then, as I sat near the hearth, warming my hands, he said the words I'll never forget. "You know, Mom, it would be easier for everyone if you just let go." I looked up at him, my voice calm. "I know what you did, John." He froze. "What?" I stood slowly. "I know about the money, the fake companies, the insurance, the doctor, all of it." He stepped forward. "You're confused. You're not well." "No," I said, my voice rising. "You thought I was weak. That age makes me stupid. But I've been watching you, and I'm not alone." That's when the front door burst open. Simone's team swept in like Judgment Day. Guns drawn, body cams flashing. John tried to run. Didn't get far. As they cuffed him on the floorboards of the cabin Thomas had built with his bare hands, I stood over him, breath steady. "You forgot something, Joan," I said. "Dawsons don't quit. We fight." You would think that justice, real justice, would bring peace. That once the monster is unmasked, the fear would fade, and life would resume like a paused movie. But after the sirens died down, after John's handcuffs clinked shut, and the flash of police lights vanished into the trees, I returned to a world that didn't know what to do with me. I wasn't just a mother anymore. I was a symbol. A cautionary tale. A headline. And symbols don't rest. The house felt colder, even with the heat turned up. Not the kind of cold you feel on your skin, but the kind that seeps into your memories. Every corner of our home whispered remnants of John birthday photos, school trophies. A macaroni Christmas ornament he made when he was 7. I couldn't bring myself to throw them out. But I also couldn't look at them. Peter stayed with me that first week. He'd always been the quiet one. He didn't ask questions, just made coffee, took out the trash, and fixed the back fence John had let rot for months. I should have said something sooner. He told me one evening as we sat on the porch, watching the last snow melt off the roof. I knew he was. Changing, but I didn't know how far gone he was. I didn't answer. I just reached over and held his hand. Emily was different. She called twice, each time more clipped than the last. "I'm trying to explain this to my kids, Mom. To Alex, to myself. How does a brother do that?" I didn't have an answer. Not for her. Not for me. At Dawson's Market, it was like walking into a funeral every day. Not of a person, but of something more intangible, trust. People averted their eyes in the hallways. Some employees left without notice. Longtime vendors asked if we'd be restructuring. There were rumors, of course. She's too old. She didn't see what was right under her nose. Maybe she's covering something up. I let them talk. I didn't fight back. Not yet. Because some things you don't fix by shouting louder, you fix them by showing up. Again and again. So I did. 5 a.m. Every morning. I was the first to unlock the doors. I scrubbed produce bins, swept aisles, took inventory by hand. Not because I needed to, but because they needed to see me do it. George reinstated full transparency in the accounting system. We hosted open audits. Every employee, no matter the level, had access to vendor contracts, payout records, and department budgets. Nothing hidden. Nothing off limits. Linda called it the Great Thaw. Even Rosa, my sweet, quiet Rosa, stayed late one evening to clean the windows in the front, and I caught her singing softly in Spanish. I didn't understand the words, but I understood the feeling. Things were shifting. We lost 3 major suppliers who didn't want the drama. But we gained 5 new local vendors, small farms and minority-owned businesses who believed in the comeback story. One of them, a young black woman named Janelle, said to me during our first meeting, "Your strength, what you lived through, that's what makes me trust you, not your logo." That stayed with me. We started a new community program too. Maggie's Market Bags, weekly bundles of fresh produce for single parents and elderly residents. Rosa ran the delivery side. Peter helped with logistics. I wrote personal notes for each bag, hand-signed, just like we used to in the early days. People started talking again, but this time in hope. Then, one morning, I walked into the store and found something taped to the front door. A yellow envelope, no name, just the words, "She never gave up on us." Inside was a donation check, $10,000 from a former employee I hadn't seen in years. No return address, just a note. "Use this to keep going." And we did. By April, the break room laughter had returned. By May, customer foot traffic was higher than the year before. By June, we broke even on losses. And then came the trial. John's lawyer tried everything, claimed mental stress, financial pressure, even painted me as an unstable, controlling mother. I sat through it all, quiet, steady. But when they played the tape, his voice, at that cabin, telling me to let go, the courtroom stilled like a breath held too long. He didn't look at me once during sentencing. The judge handed down 25 years for attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy. I didn't cheer. I didn't cry. I simply whispered a prayer not for him, but for whatever part of me he tried to kill. After the verdict, reporters hounded me again. "Mrs. Dawson, do you forgive your son?" I paused. Then I said, "I forgive the boy I raised. I don't know the man he became." It was the truth. Nothing more, nothing less. That evening, I went home and sat by the fire. The plaque Rosa made hung above the mantel. "The cold never broke you." End quote. And in that quiet moment, for the first time in months, I let the warmth sink in, not just into my skin, but into the place in me that had frozen shut since the day John turned the lock. I wasn't whole, but I was healing, and that was enough for now. After the trial, the world seemed to exhale. The pressure that had built for months finally released its grip, and for the first time in a long while, I slept through the night without waking up to check the front door. But healing isn't linear. It doesn't come in waves. It comes in trickles, slow and uncertain, like thawing snow. One moment you feel whole again, and the next, you're reaching for a memory that hurts more than it comforts. That summer, I turned 75. Alex threw me a surprise party in the store's community hall, a space we'd recently reopened for events. There were banners, homemade pies, and even a mariachi band Rosa had arranged through her church. It was loud, loving, and awkward in the way families stitched back together often are. Peter flew Emily and her kids out from California. We hadn't spoken face-to-face since the trial. She was cautious, like she was walking barefoot across cracked ice, unsure if it would hold. "I still don't know how to talk about John," she admitted during one of the quieter moments, when the kids were chasing balloons and the music had softened. "Then don't," I said, setting my hand gently on hers. "Talk about yourself, talk about your boys, talk about what still matters." She nodded, eyes misty. "Okay." And for that afternoon at least, we talked about strawberries, bedtime stories, and the chaos of raising boys in the age of TikTok. Back at Dawson's Market, we made real changes. Not just cosmetic ones. We stripped out every policy John had implemented that centralized control. We flattened the hierarchy. Employees at every level were given seats at the quarterly meetings. We added mental health days, rotating manager programs, and a profit-sharing bonus tied not just to sales but to customer satisfaction. People said it couldn't work, that you can't run a business like a family anymore. But they didn't know that this business was built by a family who started with nothing but a borrowed cooler, a handwritten sign, and a whole lot of grit. We also started a legacy scholarship in Thomas's name for kids in Bloomington who wanted to study business with ethics at its core. The first recipient was a soft-spoken high school senior named Malik, who helped his mom clean houses after school. When he gave his thank you speech, he said, "I want to build something that helps people, not hurts them." I felt Thomas smiling somewhere nearby. And then, one morning, he came back. Not Thomas. I know better than to hope for that, but someone from that chapter of my life. His name was Earl Price, a name I hadn't heard in over 50 years. He'd been Thomas's best friend in college, a war buddy, a groomsman at our wedding. And once before I met Thomas, he was the boy I danced with under the bleachers at a church picnic, thinking the world couldn't get any bigger than Indiana in the summer. He walked into the store one July morning, taller than I remembered, hair completely white, wearing a veteran's cap and a worn-out smile. "I heard you raised hell," he said. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my clipboard. Earl had been living in Kentucky for decades, raising his grandkids and keeping bees. But he'd followed the news, watched the trial, knew what I'd endured. We had lunch at the diner down the street, the same one Thomas and I used to visit after Sunday church. Earl didn't press, didn't pry. He just listened. Asked about Peter, Emily, Alex, about the store, about the cinnamon rolls still the best in the state, in my humble opinion. "I always knew you had a fire in you," he said between bites. "But I never thought I'd see you set a match to the whole damn machine and rebuild it from scrap." I looked at him and said, "I didn't want to. But when someone you love tries to bury you, you either stay buried or dig yourself out and build something stronger." That lunch turned into more lunches. Sometimes dinners. Sometimes long walks around the park near the old train tracks. People started whispering, of course, that Maggie Dawson was seeing someone. I let them talk, because what they didn't know was this: Earl wasn't here to replace anyone. He was here to remind me that I was still living, that not all men betray, that not all memories end in sorrow. He brought me honey from his bees. I gave him pie recipes from my mother, and somewhere in between, the silence in my home started to feel like peace instead of punishment. I still talk to Thomas sometimes when I'm pruning the tomatoes, or when the wind shifts just so, carrying that smell of tobacco and old books he used to leave behind. "I'm okay," I tell him. "You'd be proud." And I believe he would be. Because Dawson's Market didn't just survive. It became a sanctuary. A place for second chances. For real conversations. For cinnamon rolls and forgiveness. A place where even a woman locked in a freezer by her own son could come back, not as a victim, but as a builder of something better. Success has a strange way of unsettling people. Once the dust settles and the fires are put out, people expect calm skies forever. But I've lived too long to believe in endless summers. It had been 9 months since John's sentencing. Dawson's Market was thriving again. We'd hired new managers, young, bright, hungry, to prove that integrity could survive in a profit-driven world. We started weekend cooking classes for seniors, sponsored school lunch programs, and brought back the annual Fall Harvest Festival in downtown Bloomington. People stopped whispering about "that freezer lady" and started calling me Maggie the Miracle. I smiled at the nickname, but I knew better. Miracles aren't magic. They're built slowly, quietly, painfully. It was mid-September when the storm came. Not a real one, though. Indiana skies threatened rain that week, but something far more insidious. A rumor. It started small. A local blogger posted an anonymous tip claiming Dawson's Market was inflating prices and falsifying donation numbers to gain publicity. No sources. No proof. Just enough spark to light the dry grass. In a matter of days, the story spread. Social media lit up. Fake philanthropy? Maggie Dawson's redemption? A lie? A few angry customers returned bags of produce, shouting at cashiers like they were CEOs. It wasn't true. Of course it wasn't. But truth doesn't spread nearly as fast as suspicion. Alex called me from his apartment. "Grandma, you want me to go public? Release the donation records? The financials?" I sat in my office, holding a framed photo of Thomas and me in front of the very first Dawson's Market. My hands trembled, but not with fear. With fury. "No," I told him. "Let me talk first." That evening, I stood in front of the store under gray skies. Employees gathered, customers lingered, reporters hovered like buzzards. I cleared my throat. "Some of you have heard a story about us, that we've lied, stolen, pretended to be something we're not." I paused. Let the silence thicken. "Well, here's my story," I continued. 3 years ago, my own son tried to kill me. He wanted my money, my business, my silence. And when I survived, I made a vow not just to rebuild this store, but to rebuild trust. A soft wind rustled the leaves. We've given more in the last year than we did in the 5 before it. We opened our books to the public. We gave seats at the table to cashiers, janitors, delivery drivers. We did it not because it looks good, but because it's right. Someone in the back shouted, "Then prove it." So I did. That night, we uploaded our complete donation logs to the website. Every cent tracked, every itemized vendor invoice, even the emails between partners confirming what was delivered. But I didn't stop there. The next morning, I walked into the office of the blogger who started the rumor Tyler Marsh, 29, self-proclaimed watchdog, ran a newsletter from a cluttered apartment above a coffee shop. He looked like he expected me to bring lawyers. Instead, I brought cinnamon rolls. He blinked. Mrs. Dawson?" I sat down, looked him in the eye. "Before you post something next time, son, ask yourself if it's truth or just a headline." He shifted uncomfortably. "I thought someone sent me a tip and—" "I know," I said gently. "But you didn't check. You didn't ask. You didn't knock on the door of the very place you accused." He apologized. Publicly. The next day, he ran a retraction, along with an interview we did in his apartment about community, forgiveness, and why being loud doesn't always make you right. It went viral for all the right reasons. And just like that, the storm passed. But I didn't forget. Because here's what that week reminded me. Trust, like a home, is built brick by brick, but torn down in a single swing. So I made a decision. I stepped down as CEO of Dawson's Market. Not out of fear, not from pressure, but because I had done what I came back to do. I named Rosa as community liaison, a newly created executive position. Linda took over day-to-day operations. And we hired a new CEO, Janelle, the same young woman who once said she trusted me because of what I'd been through. Some called me foolish for giving up control, but I didn't see it as giving up. I saw it as passing the torch and making sure it burned brighter than ever. I still walk the aisles, still greet customers, still write the hand-signed notes for Maggie's market bags every Friday. And sometimes, late at night, I walk to the storage room, yes, that room, and I touch the freezer door. Cold, silent, harmless. It never scares me, because I'm not afraid of cold anymore. What scares me is forgetting what it taught me, and I won't. Ever. There's a quiet that comes after the storm, not silence, but a kind of settled hush, like the world is holding its breath, waiting to see if you'll collapse or carry on. I chose to carry on. Stepping down from the helm of Dawson's Market wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something I hadn't allowed myself in decades: stillness. For the first time in nearly 50 years, I didn't wake up thinking about invoices or inspections. I didn't have to worry about supply chain logistics or holiday staffing issues. My mornings became slower, fuller. I started walking more, just me, my thermos, and the morning air of Bloomington. Sometimes Earl joined me, sometimes not. We'd stroll through the farmer's market or down to the lake trail, talking about everything and nothing. One morning, as we sat on a park bench feeding ducks, he said, "You ever think about what comes next, Maggie?" I raised an eyebrow. "You mean after retirement?" "No," he said, tossing a crust of bread. "I mean after all of it, when the story ends. What'll they say about you?" I took a long sip of my coffee. The wind picked up, just enough to lift the edge of my scarf. "I hope," I said slowly, "they'll say I didn't stop trying, even when everything told me to." Earl nodded, didn't speak. That's one thing I appreciated about him. He knew the value of silence. Later that week, something unexpected happened. I was browsing the canned goods aisle at our downtown store. Old habits die hard when a young woman tapped me on the shoulder. "Mrs. Dawson?" I turned. She was maybe 30, with curly auburn hair and freckles, wearing an apron with the store logo. Her eyes were misty. "You probably don't remember me," she said. "I'm Janie Holloway. My mom used to work here in the 92nd. Cashier, single mom. You gave her an advance once so she could pay rent." I blinked. The name echoed. "I do remember," I said. "Surely. She used to bring you to work sometimes when school was out. You'd sit in the break room eating animal crackers. And," she smiled, "that was me." Then her expression softened. I just wanted to say, thank you. You saved us. I mean it. Mom got back on her feet. I went to college. I'm working here while I finish my nursing degree. And I still remember how you hugged her that day. She cried all the way home. I felt the heat rise behind my eyes. She reached into her apron and handed me a folded note. It read, "Sometimes you won't know the seeds you planted until long after the harvest." And I carried that note home in my coat pocket. Saturday with it in the kitchen. Read it again by candlelight like it was a prayer. Because here's what I'd started to understand. Legacy isn't built in grand speeches or public gestures. It's built in the quiet choices, one advance paycheck, one second chance, one warm hug when someone's falling apart. The next day, I called Peter and asked if he wanted to help me start a new project. We called it Harvest House, and a nonprofit partnership with the local food bank and school district focused on transitional housing, job training, and emergency childcare for struggling single parents. It wasn't flashy, it wouldn't make headlines, but it would matter. Peter took the lead. Emily helped with the digital side from California. Alex volunteered on weekends when he wasn't buried in bar prep. Even Rosa came by to help cook meals during orientation weeks. And me? I showed up. Saturday with the parents, listened to their stories, held their babies while they filled out paperwork. Sometimes I just sat on the porch and watched the wind move through the cornfields nearby. Earl built a garden out back, tomatoes, zucchini, some late-blooming sunflowers. "Can't grow peace," he said, "but you can grow something that gives people a reason to stay." I believed him. One evening, I was sitting on the swing behind Harvest House when Peter brought me a letter mailed with no return address. Inside was a simple white card. No words, just a drawing, a freezer, and a flame. It wasn't signed, but I knew. John. Somehow, somewhere, from wherever he was, he sent it. I stared at the card for a long time. Then, without a word, I tucked it under my arm, walked to the fire pit, and tossed it in. I watched it burn, not with hate, not with vengeance, but with peace. Because some chapters don't need a sequel. They just need to end. The past has a way of waiting for you. You can move houses, change routines, fill your days with projects and people, but the past is patient. It waits in the quiet, in the stillness, in the space between heartbeats. That's what I thought about the day I stood again before the house on Hemlock Road, the place where Thomas and I built a life brick by brick, mortgage by mortgage, child by child. The paint had faded. The rose bushes were overgrown, and the gate squeaked louder than I remembered. But the bones of the place stood proud, like they had been holding their breath all this time, waiting for me to come back. Earl stood beside me, silent as always, hands in the pockets of his corduroy coat. We didn't say much. We didn't need to. I walked through each room like visiting an old friend. The living room still held the faint scent of cedar. The kitchen cupboards creaked the same way they had when the kids used to sneak cookies. Upstairs, the hallway was lined with faded photos. Birthdays, school plays, Sunday mornings in matching flannel. And in our bedroom hours, I sat on the edge of the bed, still made neatly from the last time I touched it. My hand grazed Thomas's nightstand. I opened the drawer. Inside, folded carefully, was an old program from our 25th wedding anniversary. On the back, in his handwriting, he had written, "This house is not made of wood and stone. It's made of promises." I didn't cry. I smiled. Because even though so much had changed, that part of him, that quiet strength, was still here, still holding me up. Later that week, I made a decision. We weren't going to sell the house. We weren't going to lock it up or leave it to collect dust. We were going to fill it with life again. That's how the Dawson House of Second Chances began. It started as an idea in a notebook. Then it became blueprints. Then it became paint samples and city permits and late-night meetings with community organizers. Earl took charge of the yard, pulling weeds and building new garden beds. Peter handled the contractors. Emily helped fundraise from her network in California. Linda returned on weekends, organizing volunteers. Even Rosa's eldest son offered to fix the plumbing for free. But what mattered most were the women who came knocking. Single mothers with nowhere to go. Women rebuilding after abusive marriages. Young girls released from the county jail with only a plastic bag of belongings and no one to call. We welcomed them in, gave them a key, a clean bed, warm food, and a new start. And I cooked. Saturday on the front porch. Listened. I wasn't their savior. I was just present. Sometimes that's all someone needs. One night, a woman named Sierra, 24, with a toddler and eyes that had seen too much, sat beside me and asked, "Do you think people like me really change?" I looked at her, saw the fear behind the question, the hunger for permission to hope. "People don't change in a day," I said. "They change in dishes washed. Diapers changed. Nights endured. They change in choosing to stay when running would be easier." She nodded, held my hand. That was enough. Then, in late November, I received a letter I hadn't expected. It came from the mayor's office, embossed and formal. The city council had voted unanimously to name the Dawson House a historical and humanitarian landmark. I laughed when I read it, laughed so hard I had to sit down. All those years fighting for shelf space and supply routes and quarterly profits, and now, the real recognition came from cornbread and conversation and a porch swing that never stopped moving. They asked if I would attend the dedication ceremony in December. I agreed, with one condition, that everyone involved, from the paint crews to the residents, be included. The day came cold and bright, snow flurries just beginning to fall. People gathered in coats and scarves, holding thermoses of cider, standing shoulder to shoulder under the new Dawson House sign, carved from local maple wood. The mayor spoke first, then a city historian, then a woman I hadn't expected, Tamika, one of the first residents who now worked as a counselor at a nearby women's shelter. She stood behind the microphone, trembling but strong. "I came here with nothing but fear," she said. "But Maggie didn't look at me like I was broken. She looked at me like I was still whole." She paused, wiped her eyes. "I'm standing here today with a job, a home, and a future. Because she gave me the thing I never thought I deserved. A second chance." End of quote. I felt my knees weaken. Earl stepped closer, steadying me with one arm. Then the mayor took the mic again. "We hereby declare the 12th of December to be Margaret Dawson Day in Bloomington, Indiana, for her unwavering commitment to justice, to community, and to the quiet revolution of kindness." They handed me a plaque. I didn't read it right away. Instead, I turned to the crowd, looked at all the faces, young, old, white, black, brown, mothers and daughters and neighbors and friends, people who had come, not because of what I built, but because of what we became. "I don't have a speech," I said, "but I have this. I spent most of my life building a business. Then I spent the rest surviving the storm that nearly destroyed it. But the real work, the most sacred work, began only after the storm passed." I paused. I thought legacy meant leaving something behind. But maybe it means planting something that keeps growing long after you're gone. And well, that night, I sat alone in the front parlor of the house. Snow tapping against the window panes, a fire crackling soft in the hearth. And then Earl walked in, holding a plain white envelope. "This came today," he said. "No return address. Just my name in a hand I hadn't seen in a long time." I opened it slowly. Inside was a letter. From John. It arrived on a Tuesday morning. The kind of morning where the sun hasn't quite committed to rising, and the world is still yawning awake. Rosa had just brought in the mail, bundled in rubber bands and dusted with frost. It was sitting at the bottom of the pile. No return address. Just my name, written in a hand I hadn't seen in nearly 2 years, tight, familiar, unmistakably John's. I stared at it for a long while. Didn't open it in the kitchen. Didn't take it to my desk. Instead, I wrapped myself in Thomas's old coat and walked out to the bench beneath the dogwood tree behind Dawson House, the same bench where I'd once read bedtime stories to my children, where I sat after the trial, where I'd learned how to breathe again. And there, under bare branches and a pale sky, I opened the envelope. The letter was 5 pages. Each line pressed into the paper like a confession that couldn't be whispered. It didn't begin with, "Dear Mom." No sentiment. No salutation, just a simple line. I thought about starting with sorry, but I know you've heard that word enough to hate it by now. That stopped me. He was right. Sorry had been spoken, written, performed so many times in my life by lawyers, reporters, board members, that it had lost its shape. But what followed was different. I used to believe you'd never understand me, that you didn't see me, that you always favored Peter or respected Emily more because they didn't fail like I did. But sitting in this place, this quiet, slow, endless place, I've started to realize maybe you did see me, maybe too clearly, and that terrified me. When I looked at you, I saw discipline, clarity, conviction, and when you looked at me, I saw reflection, and I hated what I saw. I can't explain why I did what I did, not fully, but part of it came from fear, part from wanting to be something on my own, and part, God help me, from believing the lie that if you were gone, I'd finally be free. My hands trembled as I held the paper. The wind stirred the leaves around my feet. Somewhere nearby, a wind chime sang once, soft and hollow. I kept reading. You've probably heard this from the prosecutors, but in case you haven't, I pled guilty. No trial. No more lies. The judge didn't even speak when he passed the sentence. Just looked at me like I was already gone. But I found something here. Not redemption. Not yet. But truth. Honest, brutal, bare truth. I was wrong. I was broken. And I didn't just try to take your life. I tried to erase your legacy. The part that haunts me most isn't the freezer. It's knowing that I watched you tap for help and felt nothing. That line took the breath from my chest. I could feel it again, the metal shelf, the frost clinging to my lungs, the echo of my ring against steel, desperate and rhythmic. And now, I knew he had been there, listening, choosing. I don't expect forgiveness. I've barely begun forgiving myself. But I think you deserve to know this. I have not spent one day here pretending to be innocent. There's no parole in my future. I didn't ask for leniency. I told the court I wanted the full sentence. Because even if I live to see the other side, I want whatever remains of my life to mean something honest. For once, the 5th page was written slower. The handwriting softened. I keep a picture of us. From when I was 6. You're holding me on your hip, and I'm wearing a Halloween cape and cowboy boots. I look ridiculous. You look fierce. Like no one in the world could hurt me. Sometimes I stare at it and wonder how I became the one who did. I don't know if I can be your son again, but I will always be the boy who once believed his mother could fly. If you write back, I'll read it every day. If you don't, I'll understand. John, the wind stopped. I folded the letter gently, as though any rough movement might undo the careful honesty he'd stitched into each word. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't moved, but because the ache had changed. It wasn't sharp anymore. It was quiet, heavy, human. Later that evening, I sat at the same desk where I had read it and pulled out a blank page. I thought about what to say, what not to say. And then, I wrote, John, I am not the judge of your soul. That burden isn't mine to carry. I don't know if time will bring us closer or further apart. But I believe in truth. And I believe in second chances, not always to restore what was, but to build something better with what's left. You were my child before you were a man, and no action, however dark, can erase the memory of the boy who clung to my apron while I shelved cans of soup. I don't forgive what you did, not yet, but I forgive the part of you that's trying to become someone new. You are not gone to me, not completely, not forever. I hope you keep writing. Mom, I sealed the letter. Walked it to the post office myself. No fanfare, no announcement. Just one mother, sending a light into a dark place, hoping it might reach. It began with a postcard, a simple, hand-drawn card, slipped into the mail slot at Dawson House, no return address. Just a sketch of a woman standing in front of a building, her arms outstretched, surrounded by small flames that didn't burn, but lit the space around her. Inside, one sentence. Please don't stop telling your story. Some of us are still surviving ours. It was unsigned, no explanation, but I felt the weight of it as if it had been spoken aloud. I placed the card on the mantel next to Thomas's photo and Rosa's plaque. That night, I couldn't sleep, not from worry but from the sense that something was calling. Not in the loud way life sometimes demands, but in the quiet pull of something unfinished. The next morning, I received a phone call. Mrs. Dawson? A voice asked, gentle, but firm. My name is Lily Bennett. I'm a professor at Indiana University. I teach a course on narrative healing and intergenerational trauma, and I believe your voice is exactly what my students need." She had read about Dawson House, watched my short speech at the Winter Lights Festival, and now she was inviting me to speak not as a survivor, not as a guest of honor, but as a teacher. I almost said no. Public speaking never suited me. I had spent most of my life behind counters, in back offices, writing notes on ledgers and soup cans. But something in her voice reminded me of Emily, eager, steady, hopeful. And the thought of facing a room full of young people, not to relive the pain, but to offer them tools to make sense of their own. I said yes. The weeks leading up to the lecture were filled with more questions than answers. What would I say? Who was I now after all this? A former business owner? A wounded mother? A reluctant community leader? One evening, I sat on the porch with Earl. The sky was painted in that late winter gold, the kind that promises spring but still carries the memory of frost. "Do you think I'm ready to talk?" I asked him. He smiled softly. "Maggie, you've already been talking, just not into a microphone." And he was right. I had been telling my story every day, through cinnamon rolls in the kitchen, through quiet letters to John, through the open doors of Dawson House. But this would be different. This time, the story wasn't just mine. It belonged to everyone who'd ever been betrayed and kept breathing. March 15th came with a surprising warmth. Bloomington thawed under a blue sky, students sprawled on campus lawns like early tulips testing the sun. Earl drove me in his truck, and Peter insisted on walking me to the lecture hall. Inside, it was full. Not just students, but faculty, local residents, even a group of seniors from a retirement community who had heard about that freezer woman with the fire in her voice. I stepped up to the podium. My hands trembled. My throat was dry. Then I looked out at the room and saw more than eyes. I saw hearts, waiting not for a headline, but for a companion, someone to walk with them into their own memories. So I began not with the freezer, not with John, but with Thomas, with the first box of canned goods, with the moment I realized love isn't a shield, it's a promise to stand even when it shatters. "I am not extraordinary," I said. "I am simply still here." The room held its breath with me. I spoke about building something from scratch, about watching it nearly collapse, and about the long, aching road back not to what was, but to something better. I talked about community and cinnamon rolls and how forgiveness sometimes feels more like laying bricks than breaking chains. When I finished, no one clapped at first. They just stood, as if rising was the only way to honor what had been shared. Later, in the lobby, a young woman approached me, her cheeks flushed, holding a worn copy of a diary. "I lost my mother last year," she whispered. "I haven't been able to speak about it, but you made me believe I might be able to write." I touched her arm gently. "Then that's where your voice lives. Start there." By the end of the day, Dr. Bennett asked if I'd consider joining a quarterly panel for survivors of trauma who became community leaders. "Mais, a panelist." I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my tea. But I said yes. Because maybe that's what this next chapter was about, not surviving, not rebuilding, but giving voice to the quiet fire in others. That evening, back in the warm kitchen of Dawson House, Earl handed me a box wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a microphone. A small one. Portable. "For your stories," he said, "when you're not home." I held it in my hand, heavy with meaning, because maybe, after a lifetime of listening, it was finally time to speak. I never imagined I'd see my name on a program, printed under the words, "Keynote Speaker." But there it was, ink on paper, neatly stacked at the entrance to a community center in southern Illinois. I was the closing speaker for a weekend symposium on survivorship and memory. I had been invited not as a scholar, nor a politician, but as a woman who lived to tell. Over the past year, I had traveled from church basements in Detroit to conference halls in Lexington. I'd spoken to high school students, prison counselors, retired nurses, and first-generation college kids. I'd eaten potluck dinners in church kitchens, signed cookbooks in libraries, and listened to a dozen people tell me, through tears, "You told my story before I could." But that night in Illinois, something different happened. I had just finished speaking. The room was quiet, not stunned, just full. Heavy in the way grief and hope often sit together. Then a woman stood, She looked about 40, with tight curls, glasses, and a long scarf wrapped like armor around her shoulders. Her voice didn't shake. It rang. "I respect your survival," she said. "But how can you talk about forgiving your son when some of us lost people will never get back? When some of us can't ever forgive?" The room stiffened. All eyes turned to me. I took a deep breath, and I said, "Forgiveness isn't a trophy. It's not proof of moral strength. It's not owed, not expected, not always possible." I looked her in the eye. I didn't forgive what he did. I forgave the part of him that used to laugh when I tickled his feet at age 4. I forgave the part I carried in my own body once. But I still carry what he did. Every day. I stepped closer. And if you never forgive someone, that's okay too. Survival comes in many shapes. Yours is no less sacred than mine. End of row. She didn't speak, but she nodded. Once. That was enough. Later that night, I sat in my motel room, bare walls, hum of traffic outside, and reread a letter I'd received earlier that week. I hadn't opened it until now. It was from John. The last, he said. "Mom, this will be my final letter, not because I'm shutting a door, but because I finally understand that some stories have to end where they began. With you. I've stopped trying to rewrite what happened. Instead, I'm learning how to sit with it. I teach now business ethics to a dozen men with tired eyes. We talk about the cost of silence, the weight of shortcuts, the parts of ourselves we ignore until they rot. Sometimes I tell them about you, not about the freezer, but about the way you held our family together, how you showed up again and again, even when no one asked. If they ask why you didn't abandon me completely, I tell them, because she was never in the business of throwing people away. I know I was once the coldest thing in your life, but you were always the light. This is not goodbye. This is me, finally stepping out of your story and trying to write my own. John." I folded the letter carefully, not to hide it, but to keep it close, without letting it lead me anymore. The next day, I declined a panel in Ohio. I canceled a trip to a speaking summit in Texas. Not out of weariness, out of clarity, because I had one more place to be. That Friday, I walked into the gymnasium of a small elementary school in Monroe County. It smelled like peanut butter and pencil shavings and laughter. I stood before a room of third graders, their legs swinging from folding chairs. And I told them a story not about pain or betrayal or freezing air, but about a little store, and a woman who kept showing up, and a tomato plant that grew sideways and still gave fruit. When I finished, a boy with big glasses raised his hand and asked, "Did you win?" I smiled. "I lived," I said, "and I shared. That's more than winning." He nodded solemnly. "Okay." And afterward, the teacher handed me a stack of cards, crayon drawings, stick figures, sunshine. One said, "You are brave. You are like a grandma dragon that protects nice people." I laughed so hard I had to sit down. And I thought, yes, let that be my legacy. Not the freeze, not the fall, but the fire I passed on. The mirror doesn't lie, even when you wish it would. I stood in the small bathroom of Dawson House one morning, brushing my hair with slower strokes. The silver in my roots had taken over long ago. My hands, once strong enough to lift crates, now trembled just enough to remind me that time keeps its promises. I was 80 now, still waking early, still walking the halls, still folding laundry when no one asked me to. But I felt it the slow closing of a chapter, not with fear but with gravity. My doctor told me the word no one wants to hear. Early stage cognitive decline. It wasn't urgent. Not yet. But it explained the occasional misplaced keys, the forgotten name of a new staff member, the story I'd already told twice in one sitting. "It happens," he said gently. "It's not the end. It's just the beginning of another shape of memory. Another shape." I like that. I walked home that day, Earl at my side, and I said, "I think it's time I started writing things down." He looked at me sideways. "You've been doing that for years." "No," I said. "Not for the world. For them." "Oh." So I began. One letter for Peter about patience, and how being the quiet one doesn't make your voice any less worthy. One for Emily, about the strength of daughters, and how sometimes leaving home is the only way to bring its values into the world. One for Alex, my sweet, sharp grandson. I told him about his mother's laugh, his grandfather's favorite hymn, and the way he looked at me the day we planned John's undoing. I told him he would make a fine father one day, if he remembered to listen more than speak. I wrote one for Rosa, too, about loyalty, survival, and the way her quiet presence had saved my life more than once. And yes, I wrote one for John. Not long, not heavy. Just a few pages tucked into the cedar box with the others. It began, "You are not your worst moment," and it ended, "I will always be your mother, even when memory forgets your name." I sealed the envelopes, labeled each one, left instructions with Earl and Linda about where they should go and when. Then I started telling stories again. Not on panels, not in city halls. In the reading nook by the fireplace at Dawson House. Every Friday afternoon, I'd gather the kids of residents, or volunteers, or just neighbors passing through. I'd sit in the same old chair, with a quilt over my legs, and begin. Once upon a time, there was a woman made of fire. Sometimes the kids would ask if that was me. I'd just wink and say, "You'll have to decide for yourself." I told stories about magic stores and brave grandmothers, about letters that traveled across time and gardens, that bloomed even in frost. And sometimes, when I was honest, I told them about the cold, about the son who forgot his heart, about the mother who didn't. But I always ended with the fire, because that's the part worth remembering. One afternoon, as the leaves began to turn again, a little girl named Nia asked, "What happens when the fire goes out?" I looked at her, this child with hair full of barrettes and eyes full of thunderclouds, and I said, "Then someone else lights it again." That night, I sat with Earl on the porch. The air was crisp. Our tea had gone lukewarm. He turned to me and asked, "Do you feel done?" He shook my head. "I feel ready." Then I took his hand in mine, warm and steady. "Promise me," I whispered, "if I forget any of it, you'll remind me who I was." He kissed the back of my hand. "You'll never forget the fire," he said. "It's who you are." And just like that, we watched the sun set, not as a farewell, but as a torch passed forward. The forgetting came slowly. At first, it was harmless, misplaced teacups, names dancing just out of reach. Then came the repeated questions. The calendar on the fridge, marked carefully each week, began to blur in her mind like melted wax. But she was never afraid. Not exactly. Because even as the names began to slip, and the years folded in on themselves like pages read too often, Maggie still felt things, still recognized the contours of love, of kindness, of home. Sometimes she called Rosa Linda. Sometimes she asked if Thomas was still at the store. Sometimes she sat on the porch and asked Earl if they had met before. He always said yes, always gently. It was late spring when the family came home. Emily flew in with her boys. Peter drove from Maine. Alex had finished law school and took leave from his first job just to be around. There was no crisis, no announcement, just a quiet gathering, as if the wind itself had whispered, "It's time to be near her." Dawson House felt fuller than it had in years. Children ran down hallways, laughter spilled from the kitchen. Someone put a pie in the oven and forgot it twice. Maggie didn't quite remember why they were all there. At one point, she leaned over to Peter and asked, "Is someone getting married?" Peter smiled. "No, Mom, we just wanted to hear you tell a story." She looked around the room, confused for a moment. Then someone placed her in her favorite chair by the fire, a quilt draped over her knees, a warm cup of tea placed gently in her hands. And slowly, like muscle memory, her voice rose. "Once upon a time," she began, "there was a woman made of fire." The room fell silent. The children at her feet stopped fidgeting. The adults held their breath. Maggie continued. She told them about a little store, and a boy who grew hungry with ambition, and a freezer colder than any winter Indiana had ever known. She told them about betrayal, and resilience, and letters, and cinnamon rolls. She didn't say the word John. She didn't say me. But everyone in the room knew, and she told it like she'd heard it 100 times, like it belonged to someone else. And maybe, in that moment, it did. Because the Maggie speaking wasn't the woman who feared forgetting. She was the storyteller, the keeper of fire. When she finished, no one moved. Then Nia, now 10, The same girl who once asked about fire going out stood and whispered, "That was the best story ever." Maggie smiled, her eyes glistening with a kind of recognition that had no name. "I'm glad you liked it," she said softly. "Someone told it to me once. I just passed it on." That evening, Earl found her sitting alone on the porch. The stars had come out. The trees rustled like old friends catching up. "I don't remember why they came," she said, eyes distant but calm. "They came for you," he said, "to hear your story, from the only one who could tell it right." She looked at him, uncertain. Was it mine? He reached for her hand. "It is you, Maggie. Even when you forget the words, you'll always be the fire." And under that Indiana sky, with memory slipping through her fingers like river water, she closed her eyes and breathed in the warmth of home, not knowing where she'd been, but certain, somehow, that she belonged. By the time Maggie turned 85, the world had grown louder around her, even as her own voice faded. She no longer walked alone, no longer remembered the names of every flower in the garden. Her days were filled with soft routines, warm blankets, afternoon sun, gentle music, and the rustling voices of others carrying the life she had once held in her hands. She rarely spoke now, but when she did, it mattered. Sometimes, when Peter visited, she'd smile at him and say, "You always had your father's kindness." Other days, she'd stare out the window and whisper, "Where's the garden? I planted something there." And she had, because Dawson House was more than a shelter now. It was a community center, a food co-op, a training facility, and a place where single parents, veterans, immigrants, and anyone needing a new beginning could come not just to survive but to belong. They kept her chair by the fireplace, even when she didn't use it anymore. Children still gathered every Friday to hear stories now told by Tamika, Sierra, or even Rosa's daughter. They still began the same way. Once upon a time, there was a woman made of fire. Maggie sat in a sunlit room most days, in a comfortable recliner by the window, her hands folded gently in her lap, her eyes soft, sometimes fixed on a spot beyond the trees. Earl sat beside her, reading aloud when she was awake, humming when she wasn't. And she listened. You could see it in the way her eyelids fluttered when he said her name, in the way her fingers tapped, just slightly, when music played. Then, one spring morning, something happened. Alex returned to Bloomington not alone, but with his newborn daughter, Amelia Grace Dawson. He brought her to Dawson House quietly, without announcement. He walked through the halls his grandmother built, past the gardens she had planted, into the quiet room where Maggie sat facing the window, as the sunlight filtered through lace curtains. He sat beside her and placed Amelia wrapped in a yellow quilt into her lap. "Grandma," he whispered, "I want you to meet someone." Maggie didn't speak, didn't blink. Her head tilted slightly. Alex held his breath. Then Maggie's hand slow, shaking rose and gently touched the baby's cheek. Her lips parted. She didn't say a name, but she hummed. A slow, low lullaby, the one Thomas used to sing. Alex closed his eyes, because he knew, in that moment, that the fire hadn't gone out. It had simply settled deeper, into blood, into breath, into a legacy passed through lullabies and letters and garden beds. Weeks passed, then months. Dawson's Market celebrated its 70th anniversary. Janelle, now CEO, gave a speech about community resilience and how our roots are held together by the stories we choose to tell. They unveiled a mural painted across the east wall of the original store. It showed Maggie, not young, not flawless, but older, wrinkled, radiant, sitting beneath a tree, reading to children, a tomato vine growing beside her, a candle glowing in the shape of a heart. Below the mural, in plain letters, "She didn't burn. She warmed us." And Maggie? She was still there, still in her chair, still watching the wind move through the garden outside. And on her best days, when the sky was blue and the tea was just right, she'd lean toward the window and whisper, "It's growing again." End of section. One morning in late June, Rosa opened the window to let the breeze in. The air was warm and sweet, thick with honeysuckle and early tomatoes ripening in the sun. Birds chattered lazily in the trees, and somewhere down the road, children were chasing each other with sidewalk chalk on their fingers and summer in their bones. Inside the sunroom of Dawson House, Maggie sat in her chair. still, peaceful, eyes closed, hands folded, a small, contented smile on her lips. No one spoke at first. They didn't need to. Because everything Maggie had to say had already been spoken in letters, in lullabies, in the quiet courage of those who walked through the doors she once built with trembling hands and an unbreakable will. Later that day, Earl found a note in the drawer of her writing desk. It was dated almost 2 years prior, written in shaky but determined script. If this note is found when I'm no longer talking, please don't mourn with silence. Tell stories, laugh loudly, pass the bread twice, and remember, grief is not the end of love, it's just the shape it takes when it has nowhere else to go. Let it walk beside you, but don't let it lead. The fire never dies, it only changes hands. Keep it burning. For someone else. Maggie. Years from now, when the children who once sat cross-legged on the carpet grow up and bring their own little ones to Dawson House, they'll point to the fireplace and say, "She used to sit right there, and she told us stories that made us brave." And maybe, just maybe, one of them will start a story with, "Once upon a time, there was a woman made of fire." Because some flames don't burn out. They become the hearth, the center, the warmth we gather around, even when the world turns cold again. Qu'avez-vous ressenti en écoutant cette histoire jusqu'au bout? Si elle a touché votre cœur, laissez le chiffre 1 en commentaire. Si vous ne vous êtes pas senti concerné, n'hésitez pas à écrire 0. Chaque retour compte énormément pour moi, car c'est grâce à vous que je continue. C'est justement à partir de ces partages que je puise l'élan pour raconter la suite. Une nouvelle histoire vous attend, encore plus profonde, plus émouvante. Et j'espère de tout cœur que vous serez là pour l'écouter avec moi.